This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
Chapter 23. Virginia Tobacco Notes. 1618. The price of merchandise was fixed. Governor Argall decreed that all goods be marked up 25% and tobacco be sold for 3s per pound. Penalty for offenders, 3 years servitude. 1624. Indian massacre. The colonists were told by the king's preachers that the Indians had become Samaritans and that they had changed. As a consequence, they were again allowed the free run of the plantations. In a simultaneous uprising, these friends almost wiped out the colony. The saving grace was word received from one Indian, only one of all the so-called friends, that an attack was imminent. Except for that warning, Virginia would have ceased to exist. As it was, the casualties were heavy, and certain of the preachers were first to be skinned alive. In spite of the loss of many settlers, it appeared that the Virginia colony was going to be successful and profitable. To reap the lion's share of the profits, the crown took the colony from the private stockholders and made it a royal province. All royal grants of land from this date provide that the crown received 1 shilling for each 50 acres of land. This followed the classic government practice of mining someone else's pocket. Virginians were required to pay these rents, quote, quit rents, due the king on their land in coin. They had virtually no way of obtaining a supply of this valuable commodity since their main money crop was tobacco. Distress was widespread. 1630, statutes were passed in Virginia vigorously punishing immoral association of races, Christian and red infidels or black proselytes. 1632, tobacco warehouses and inspectors were established. These were initially put into operation to control the quality of the product. The large quantities of poor tobacco sent to England was bringing down the value of the good product. A wise royal governor came up with a solution to Virginia's lack of money. Since tobacco had been a valuable staple of the colony since the earliest days, it was used by everyone to pay debts. The governor officially declared it to be legal tender. It was a relatively complicated variation of the ancient tally system. A law was passed requiring all tobacco to be presented to the government warehouses established by the colony. There, the hogshead container was inspected and weighed. Poor tobacco was burned. This meant the loss of the whole 800-pound lot. Good tobacco was accepted and stored in the warehouse. A tobacco note was then issued, which could be exchanged for a hogshead of prime tobacco at the location printed on the note. This tobacco note was money. It was an article created by Virginia government, and it was accepted in payment for all kinds of debts in the colony, including taxes. Not only were these notes acceptable in Virginia, when discounted to pay for transportation costs, they were accepted in New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. English tobacco buyers coming to America did not bother to visit every plantation to buy tobacco. They simply bought up tobacco notes. When they had enough for their purposes, they went to the warehouse where the tobacco was stored and claimed their tobacco. It was a neat, workable system that served the colony with great success for more than 150 years. Spanish silver and paper money. Since there were a few English coins in circulation in Virginia, the colonists encouraged the importation and circulation of Spanish coins along with the native tobacco notes. The Spanish coins were valued for their intrinsic worth and were accepted in private trade and for private debts. They were also accepted by English merchants in payment for debts. Since, however, they were not legal tender, acceptable for taxes, in England, one never knew whether or not they would be accepted by government agents in payment of taxes. As far as Britain was concerned, the colonies were the place for the younger sons, speculators, and political and religious misfits. The crown valued them for the revenues and trade they produced. There were certain things the colonies were not allowed to do, but other than that, whatever worked was all right. When Virginia needed money, she invented tobacco notes. It was workable, a sort of colonial tally. The Northeast solved its money problems in a different way. In 1690, Schenectady was destroyed by the French and Indians in a night attack. Something had to be done right then for defense, and there was no money. The General Court ordered an issue of paper bills. This money was backed by nothing but the promise to pay in silver. It was the first paper money authorized in the English colonies. 7,000 pounds were issued. Since taxes could not be paid with them, they promptly dropped 50% in value. The reason the wooden tally in England was valuable was because they could be used in payment of taxes. Massachusetts liked to issue these pieces of paper, but did not like to receive them herself if she could help it. Later, these paper notes became legal tender, but New England issued them faster than she taxed them out of circulation, so they were continuously depreciating as their numbers increased. By 1720, Massachusetts had issued 200,000 pounds, which had depreciated to a third their value. Rhode Island's paper money declined 26-1 and South Carolina's 8-1. Pennsylvania issued over 250 different paper notes. This section of America never mastered the art of price stabilization through taxing unwanted paper money out of circulation. American-British balance of trade. To understand the first economic cycle in America, we must return to Britain to review a little background history. The Bank of Scotland was established in 1695. In short order, it spread its tentacles across Scotland. Thousands of Scottish prisoners of war from the wars of 1715 and 1745 were sent to America as indentured servants for 7 years. Soon after the wars came the flood tide of Scottish refugees. These refugees had been dispossessed of everything they owned by the new usury system adopted by the Scottish banks. Their homes, cattle, businesses, land, everything went in default to the owners of the new interest banks. The merchants who remained in Scotland sank deeply into debt. The farmers who remained moved to squalid tenements in the cities. It was a replay of the Roman scenario. Virginia planters had been accustomed to order goods from their Scottish and English agents. They would settle the books when their tobacco was shipped. This had been the custom for 100 years. The British merchants were now in debt to the new interest banks. When a Virginia planter placed an order for farm implements and clothing with a merchant in Britain, that merchant now had to borrow money to fill the order. Unable to absorb the cost himself, he passed the cost along to his customer by adding 5% or 7% to the bill. 5 or 7% doesn't sound like much, but over a period of years, you see the result. Starting in the year 1705, the trade balance between Britain and America for the prior 5 years is even. In the 5-year period ending in 1740, the balance of trade started to run heavily against the colonies. This was the period when the interest banking system of Britain began to get its roots down and affect the trade of the nation. The American colonies had no experience in dealing with usury. The Church of England ministers in America were representatives of the British king, who was head of the Church of England. The king himself was deeply in debt to the moneylenders and was their servant. It was no wonder his ministers did nothing to protect their flocks. They did not dare to preach against the usury system for fear of offending their master and high priest, the king. There was no one to warn the people any more than there had been anyone to warn the English and Scottish people back in Britain 100 years earlier. The imposition of usury into the British-American trade put a drastic drain on the colonists and made the Revolutionary War inevitable. 1705. Massachusetts passed laws forbidding marriage between blacks and whites. These laws were reinforced in 1786. 1717. Maryland passed a law forbidding racial intermarriage. 1764. Good times, the 7-Year War. French and Indian War in the colonies brought a flash of prosperity, as war always does. When borrowing for the war stopped, hard times dropped over England like a blanket. Ben Franklin landed in England fresh from the war phase, good times in America, and proceeded to lecture England of that fact. When asked for the reason for these good times, he replied, "That is simple. It is only because in the colonies we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip, and we issue it in the proper proportions to the demand of trade and industry." All this sounded very nice, but it was not exactly the truth. He forgot to mention that while New England printed colonial scrip by the ton, they had no intention of taxing it out of circulation again. America and Britain were being flooded with their paper scrip. Confronted with this torrent of paper money, which grew worthless in value every day, the British merchants appealed to the British government. The British government was servant to the Bank of England. The bank was also tired of this American colonial scrip. It infringed on their monopoly. The bankers instructed Parliament to pass a law against allowing colonial scrip to be used as legal tender. This law was to take effect after September 1st, 1764. To make matters worse for the colonists, they prohibited extension. This meant that when the notes were due to expire, they were not allowed to continue circulation, as had been the practice in the past when notes came due. This effectively put an end to America's competition with the Bank of England. 1764. To get back some of the money Britain had spent on the French and Indian War in America, a Stamp Act was passed. This was one of the most irritating taxes ever passed. On top of depriving the colonists of much of their money, the tax was instituted at the very time when there was almost no money to pay them. Every legal page in a court case was taxed. Each common law action, each pleading in a chancery suit, admiralty court, and others, Bills of lading, bonds, contracts, and newspapers were taxed. Advertisements, a pack of playing cards, a pair of dice. This exceptionally high tax gives an indication of the general feeling against gambling. Certificates given to students for the college degrees were taxed. Double stamps were required if the document were in a foreign language. Predictably, destruction of stamps and intimidation of agents was general. 1765. Ordinary rates. Tavern room and board rates were again published, being unchanged year to year. Public water mills were regulated. Pendleton went surety for a friend in a defiance of biblical law prohibiting it, and lost when his friend defaulted. In England, business was in dire straits. Thousands were unemployed. The colony of Virginia was near anarchy. Archibald Ritchie, a merchant of Tappahannock, Virginia, said that he would sail his ships with British stamps on his merchandise. 400 Sons of Liberty met in 2 long lines on the main street across from Ritchie's house. A committee visited him. Ritchie agreed not to use the stamps again. A wise decision. To cool tempers, the Stamp Act was repealed.